There was that baritone. In other words, in other words, in other words, that baritone. In other words, it's in other words, 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 we found over the same there away. That your chain we haven't. But now it's time for days. In other words, you have a blast. That train is fast. That train is fast. In other words, it's quick. In other words, it's zippy. That too is slow. In other words, that bear is big. In other words, that bear is big. In other words, in other words, in other words, we are there away. We have fun. Nice.